Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Lewin. I'm the CEO of the Computer History Museum. I hope everyone is well and safe. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you to our virtual event focused on the timely and important question, should we fear AI? We've convened a credible panel of experts from the tech and media industry, as well as research organizations and NGOs, for a conversation with each other and with you in a town hall format. Our programs are made possible through the generosity of our members and donors, and we'd encourage you all to consider supporting CHM during these difficult times. We're focused on delivering a new mission to decode technology for everyone, its computing past, the digital present, and its future impact on humanity. And today, to introduce our program is Marguerite Gong Hancock, the museum's VP of Innovation. Marguerite?
Thank you so much, Daniel. I'd like to add my warm welcome to each of you watching this program today. No current technology inspires such wild fears and hopes as artificial intelligence. When automation first began transforming society nearly 300 years ago, there were few precedents. But as we enter a new wave of change with dramatic advances and widespread applications for AI, we can learn from the rich past and recent accumulated experience. We can also discuss and debate how we can shape a better future for us all. How do we want AI to affect our jobs and the future of work, our civil liberties, our personal lives? What are our fears and hopes around AI? What are key levers to make sure algorithms uplift rather than oppress, and reflect values for equity and diversity? What actions can we take as technologists, business leaders, consumers, digital citizens? To explore these questions and more, we're grateful to each of our incredible speakers who bring deep expertise and experience. They're here to discuss issues that matter to you, and special thanks to many of you who filled out a survey when you registered. Your responses have helped shape today's conversation. We're also going to have 3 live polls during the panel discussion that will come up on your screen. Feel free also to submit questions or comments using the chat feature. Now, for our program in the CHM tradition, I'll introduce our speakers through 5 numbers. Cindy Cohn, Executive Director, Electronic Frontier Foundation, 42,000 EFF's current membership. 1996, the year the court first ruled government's encryption regulations were unconstitutional. 4, the number of municipalities that banned police use of facial recognition technology in 2020. 1, the number of courts in 2021 requiring the defense to have access to the source code of DNA analysis programs used by the prosecution. 2, Bernese mountain dogs. So glad to have you back here at CHM, Cindy.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Next, Kate Darling, robot ethics expert and researcher at the MIT Media Lab. 1 book, 5 universities, 10 years in human-robot interaction, 2.9 million TED Talk views, and 4 robot dinosaur pets. Kate, welcome. Next, we have James Manyika, Chairman and Director of McKinsey Global Institute. 140 million miles, that's something contributed to required travel to do its thing. 100 years duration of an AI research project he's involved in. 33 years since first programmed a neural network. 10 science technology research labs worked in or with, and 9 Nobel laureate economists as collaborators. Grateful to you, James, for your time today. Sridhar Ramaswamy, Chief Executive, Co-founder of Neva and Venture Capital Partner at Greylock. 1 startup founded, Neva. 1 the size of his team when started at Google. 11,000 size of G team when he left Google. $100 billion, the approximate revenue from his time during his last year at Google. And 2 wonderful children. Sridhar, so grateful to you to have your voice here for the CHM Live event too.
Great to be here. Thank you.
To bring this conversation together, who could be better than Tim O'Reilly, who will be serving as our moderator. Tim is the founder, CEO, and chairman of O'Reilly Media. He has a long history of convening conversations that reshape the computer industry and frame big ideas such as open source software, Web 2.0, the maker movement, and government as a platform. He's also the author of many books, most recently WTF, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us. So here we are to talk about the future of AI and what is up to us. Tim, take it away.
All right. Great to see you all. And I'm a little disappointed that I got words instead of numbers for my introduction. Listen, there's a lot to talk about here because there has been so much fear about AI, but let's actually start with what we know. And of course, we don't know very much about the future, but we can guess because, as Mark Twain is reputed to have said, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme. So what do we learn from history? I want to throw this open to all of the panelists, but I want to start actually with you, Kate. You have a new book out, The New Breed. The subtitle is What Our History with Animals Reveals About Our Future with Robots. And that seems like a very different take on the history discussion than we've had before. So maybe you could just kick off that conversation with that.
Sure. The book actually isn't out yet. It comes out April 20th, but it's available for pre-order. And it is, like you said, it looks at the history of how we've used animals for work, weaponry, companionship, and what lessons we might learn from that when we talk about robots and AI and how to design them, how to integrate them. I feel like for most of my career in robotics, the conversations that I have had have been so centered around this idea of comparing robots to humans, artificial intelligence to human intelligence. And it makes a lot of sense that we do this because we have these new machines coming into our lives that can sense and think and make autonomous decisions and learn. So of course we compare them to ourselves, but it doesn't make a lot of sense from a technical perspective. And I also think that it really limits our conversations. It leads to some fears of the technology that I don't think are quite the right fears we should be having. And it also just, it makes no sense to me because we have another beautiful example that we could be using as an analogy that we have dealt with throughout history. We've had animals who are also autonomous entities that can sense, think, make autonomous decisions, learn. And we have partnered with animals, not because they do what we do, but because their skill sets are supplemental to ours. And so if we look at the history of using animals, it shifts our conversations in pretty meaningful ways. If we talk about robots taking all the jobs or robots replacing caretakers, what are we actually talking about? Are we really talking about the technology having this much agency? Shouldn't we be talking about some of the more human-centered decisions behind our political and economic systems and how the incentives lead to certain choices? I think that a lot of our science fiction and pop culture also falls into this, comparing these technologies to humans and giving them too much agency. And so I think that we should be concerned about the future, but I think our concerns are the wrong ones. And we have fallen into this determinism about what AI can or should or will do when really we have a lot of choices.
James, I know you've focused a lot on AI and the future of work and really the intersection with the economy more broadly. Perhaps you can address that, or of course you might have other directions you want to take that into. What do we learn from history?
Well, the history of concerns about technology and automation in jobs is actually actually a very long one, Tim. In fact, there's a wonderful story from 300 years ago in England, actually, when this issue came up. This is some of your historians may appreciate this. This is an Englishman called William Lee, who was a 16th century Englishman from Nottinghamshire. And one of the things that he had was he came up with the idea of a machine that would help his wife actually improve her knitting so that he could spend all the time with her. And to cut a long story short, when he presented this idea ultimately actually to the Queen was actually quite flabbergasted, because in fact her response to this was that, are you trying to put all my citizens and my subjects out of work? What do you think you're doing? So don't do this. So all that to say, there's a long, fascinating history with this concern about technology and automation and jobs. What we've been doing over the last 5 or 6 years is really trying to dig deep into understanding what is this intersection with technology and work. Let me pull up one other point of history, because I know, Tim, you like history. There was actually a wonderful commission in the late 1960s, which was convened by President Lyndon Johnson, to actually look at this question of technology and jobs. And one of the conclusions of that commission, the Lyndon Johnson Commission, when they published their report, was a statement that has always stayed with me, which is that technology destroys jobs, but not work. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, which is we've always had this history of technology changing what jobs are like, but at the same time also never doing away with the fact that there is always work to be done. So we've done research on looking at this question of impact on jobs in the economy. And the conclusion we come to, Tim, is that, in fact, this was the title of one of our reports a few years ago. We called it Jobs Lost, Jobs Gained. We might have called it Jobs Lost, Jobs Gained, and Jobs Changed. The point about those three statements is that, yes, there will probably be some job declines, and we can go into the details as to why that is the case, but there'll also be jobs gained as a result. And we actually find that the net of the jobs gained versus jobs lost comes out actually positive, at least for the next few decades. So this worry about a jobless future, at least for the next couple of decades, is not something we should worry about. We should think, though, about jobs changed, because in fact, there's going to be a lot of complementing of existing jobs and tasks by technology. So when you put all that together, I think what we should worry about is not the disappearance of jobs in their entirety. We should worry about how do we help people adapt and build skills to transition to the jobs as jobs changed. That's an important thing to focus on. Second, we should think about how do we help people transition from occupations that are declining to the ones that are growing. That's a transition question, in addition to the skills question. We should also think about, though, a more perhaps worrying question, which is how should we think about the wage effects? And this is the thing that I worry about more than anything else. I don't worry as much about job losses. I do worry about wage effects. The reason I worry about that, Tim, is because if you look at many of the occupations that are declining compared to the ones that are growing, many of the declining ones have always provided middle wage incomes, and those are the ones that are declining. And many of the ones that are growing have tended to be the occupations that are low wage occupations. So I worry about the wage effects, even as there will be work. Is
that really the product of AI, or is that the product of societal decisions that we make?
Oh, it's a product of societal decisions that we make. It's a function of the way the choices we've made. So we all will say we value teachers enormously. We value people who care for our children enormously. But the labor markets don't compensate those occupations as well as we say we value them. And those are choices we make as society.
Right. So going back to this theme of numbers, we have two people who are basically telling us that, yeah, the history teaches us not so bad. Okay, over to you, Cindy. Are you on the plus side or the minus side?
I do think it's all up to us, right? I mean, I lead the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We love technology. And then the question becomes, who bears the consequences if the technology gets it wrong, right? And so we've got kind of a historical example that when there's a new technology, the police begin to deploy it, and only slowly does the populace recognize that the police are using a technology, much less get control over it. And we're in the middle of this now with machine learning systems that are being readily available to law enforcement. We need to take back control over how these things get deployed, and we need to take back control over what happens if they get it wrong, which, as we all know, with a lot of machine learning systems, if you build a machine learning system on top of a racist society, you get a racist machine learning system. So I love Kate's analogy about the animals. I think that's great. I think that the difference is that animals learn a little from us. AI learns a lot from us. And I don't think that's inconsistent with her model, but I think that we need to pay attention to those things. We need to get control of these things, and we need to build in transparency and reasonable limits on how we use these things to make the technology serve us instead of the other way around.
Yeah, I will say, despite the animals not having this potential to sort of surpass us in the things that we are uniquely skilled at, they were transformational. You know, the use of dogs to help with hunting, the use of horses in warfare were as transformational as anything we've seen from machines.
But one of
Yeah.
the things that also bothers me about the current conversation is that we assign so much responsibility to the technology itself. It's like, oh, the algorithm did it. You know, how could we know? But when you compare the algorithm to, you know, a dog that's in someone's purview, you can't just point your finger. So I think the animal analogy also helps reshift this responsibility conversation and makes it more salient that it's really our responsibility to figure out how to make these technologies not racist, for example.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, one of the ironic things around machine learning and the use of machine learning and some of these techniques in the context of law enforcement is that they were kind of deployed with the idea that we'd get out of the discriminatory and racist and other ideas. Like, we know that if a judge sentences you in the morning, you're likely to get a shorter sentence than if they do it in the afternoon. Like, to pull the humans out of the conversation is one of the reasons that these systems were deployed. And they can still be helpful to that, at least to give a mirror back to you about how you're doing. But, you know, instead what they did is they took, you know, because they're looking for patterns, and they're looking for patterns in human behavior, at least, you know, kind of the level of machine learning that we're talking about with, say, predictive policing, they're going to take our problems and our biases and put them on steroids, not reduce them, unless we pay attention.
Yeah, I want to add on to what Cindy is saying. I feel that AI is going to take kind of the best and worst of us and just amplify them so much more. If it's the case that a certain class of people don't get jobs simply because of their background, and that's sort of how things work right now, and you put a machine learning system to learn from that data, you know what? It's going to now make this into an algorithm and say, hey, the algorithm said these people are unlikely to succeed, and we should listen to it because look at it. Oh my God, it is so accurate. So it's important for us to understand that in many ways, they reflect what we believe in. The second point that I would add is that it's also really important to realize that companies that want to make use of the efficiencies of AI simply will not, and one can argue, should not, think a whole lot about societal consequences. If, for example, a company figures out how to do a certain job that's done by humans today extremely efficiently, it reaps the benefits of that, but society is left to deal with the problem. Just like, you know, the slew of tech companies that came in the 90s and the first 2 decades of this century really came out of investments that came from our government, all of us, in effect, into technologies that created these companies. We also need to be thinking in terms of, if AI is a job disruptor, what are things that we as a country should be investing in to be creating jobs in the future? It's also important to remember that, yes, we can argue dispassionately about jobs going down and jobs like replacing them, but that doesn't help the actual person that is going through what is just like this incredibly difficult transformation in their life. My own dad, for example, left what he thought was a very prestigious job when he was 40 and started doing something else. I'm not sure he ever got over that in his life. To him, nothing ever compared to the kind of job that he had before. So it's one thing to say it'll all balance out, but we need to think about what's like the real impact on real people that are around us.
Sridhar, can you talk a little bit about the advertising business? Because it's actually a very interesting, concrete example. You know, and obviously, you know, programmatic advertising is not just AI, but although it's increasingly using more of the techniques there, but it's certainly an example of modern high-speed automation. It's learning from users. There's all these themes, you know, privacy invading, and it has both been a boon in many ways, particularly Google's original, you know, perfection of pay-per-click advertising, which was really trying to align advertising with the actual interests of the users. And, you know, as time went on, it seems that, you know, Google sort of started to diverge from that. You know, there's this whole pattern now where they're trying to capture the users in the same way as other, social media sites and the like. And that really goes back to this element of choice. But there's also a really interesting story there, because programmatic advertising put out of work, a class of highly paid people. And it created a different class of highly paid people. Anyway, there's some lessons really from recent history there for perhaps other fields of AI.
To me, this again points to the fact that, companies by their very nature are very good at adapting the latest and the greatest, and taking as much gain as possible. It's sort of funny, but my team built what was at the time the largest machine learning system ever on the planet. It was a system called SmartAss. This was in 2005. That was when it was first launched. And it learned at a scale that was unimaginable at the time. It also learned in real time and updated the model in real time, something that has taken a decade for other folks to catch up with. And the use of AI in advertising systems is an example of technology being applied for maximizing revenue. And what's happened as these companies have gotten bigger and bigger, and I've talked about Google, and one of the reasons why I started my company, Neva, was to offer a counterpoint to Google search, is incentives matter. And if companies don't have the right incentives, and if there are not checks and balances to what they do, you will see examples where important areas of like societal interactions, markets are just cornered by individual companies. And you see this in how antitrust is being treated today. So these are things that we need to keep an eye on. New technologies or new platforms like mobile offer situations in which one company, which is faster, better than the others, can really monopolize entire sectors. And that over the long term has a pretty bad impact on all of us.
We have a whole list of questions we wanted to get through, but we're already getting a lot of really interesting questions from the audience. And I know we were going to hold those for later, but I think let's just start weaving them in. I want to start with one because it's very much a follow-on to what you just said, Sridhar. Steve Pugh asks, what will prevent organizations, whether it's governments, corporations, or individuals, that can afford either focused or general intelligence AI from pulling further away from organizations that can't afford such technologies? Globally, inequality in many areas is already creating instability. I can't see AI helping with that at all without significant public policy to even the playing field. Any of you could respond to that.
Yeah, I'll take a first shot. I just think that especially in the world of free services, where technology matters a lot, I think antitrust needs to be rethought. I think changes like that happened 50 years ago that tied things like the effects of monopoly just on like consumer price harm and so on. I think it needs to be rethought in a pretty fundamental way. I think as a country and society, we are very unprepared for very large companies that not only take over one sector, but take over more and more sectors. At its logical extreme, I think it's important to remember that companies serve themselves. They don't serve the societies that they're a part of. And from that perspective, I think we need to take a robust, hard look at what does antitrust mean in the new information technology age.
Cindy, it looks like you want to say
Yeah,
something.
I mean, I totally agree about antitrust, but that's actually a pretty long road. We can do it, but we got some Supreme Court precedents we need to reverse to get there. I think another thing people ought to have in their arrow of things around this concern about capture is the idea of interoperability and kind of getting back to the way the internet was. We started with history, right? The internet didn't start off as little walled garden platforms that you had to go on bended knee to Mark Zuckerberg or Tim Cook in order to participate in, or AT&T or Verizon, right? Even at the telecom level, we have a history of requiring people who have these kinds of platforms to open them up. The most famous one, of course, being the FCC's requirement to let you plug something else into the wall other than a Bell phone. which gave us arguably the entire idea of a home internet. So we can do these kinds of things. They need to be targeted and careful. I'm not a big fan of overregulation, but I think that in addition to changing antitrust law, which I'm very supportive of, we really do need to think about pushing companies, whether that's through laws, but also just through pressure to open things up and allow a more interoperable, distributed environment, so that just by being the first person to offer something, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to be the only person that does. And I think that opens up a lot of space for innovation. And I think especially with these gigantic data sets that are being used to do AI, there's some serious thinking that needs to be done about how to make those not walled gardens, given the benefits for all of us by having a lot of people be able to use them.
Yeah, you bring up a really important point, Cindy, which is when people talk about the risks of AI, it's usually antitrust is not, one of the remedies, but there is this really interesting question. Is this one of those technologies that is going to vastly increase market power of a few players? And if so, is that a good thing? And what are we going to do about it?
Yeah, if I could jump on that, Tim, I think that is a very important point you bring up, because at its fundamental level, AI and machine learning these are scale-based systems. Look at the most amazing breakthroughs that have happened so far, whether you're looking at the amount of compute power we now put against them, whether it's GPUs or TPUs, whatever have you, right? These are very scale-based compute systems. Look at the breakthroughs through the very large language models we have right now, that these transformer-based models that are working on parameter models that are like 180 billion parameter big models. The amount of compute power that goes into these systems and the data sets, these are all scale-based systems. So at some level, you want that scale, because that's how you make these breakthrough progress. But at the same time, you must think about the kinds of issues that Cindy and Sridhar are raising up, which is that power, that compute scale-based power, then could easily be in the hands of a few entities or a few platforms or a few engines. And we already know that these superstar effects are quite real. I mean, we did some work a few years ago looking at, the superstar effects in the economy. And we know that the top 10% of the, most successful companies in the world now capture something like 80% of the available profit pools. And that's much worse than it was 20 years ago. So, but at the same time, you don't want to fragment these systems computationally, because then you don't get the benefit of them. So there's a tricky question here about how do you manage the market power questions that Cindy's raising, while at the same time getting the benefits of the scale and gains you get from the scale of these systems. That's the different questions. So I worry that when we simply resort back to monopoly models of 80 years ago, those systems were different. We might have to reinvent how we think about market power for this age. And
I think
it's a different set of questions.
It's tremendously important, and I think it's a good insight, but we've done it in other areas of the law, right? If you design something, you get a patent on it. Now, look, EFF, there's a lot of bad patents out there, but the basic idea of a patent is that you get a period of time where you can solely exploit it, but after that you can't anymore. We do this with copyright. We do, where you get a certain set of rights, but you don't get others. And I think that some much more thoughtful person than me could think about ways that we should think about these giant data sets that, make sure that we protect the incentive to create them without giving the kind of monopoly, control over them in the long run. And for me anyway, and then this is, me being an old school internet person, I think probably interoperability is one of those things that again, the internet really naturally supported for a long period of time before we took laws and technologies and turned ourselves into, 5 big companies scaring screenshots of the other 4, according to my friend Cory Doctorow.
I agree with you about interoperability being really important, but I think there's some surprises coming. I'm particularly interested by Google's release of BERT, and which is a large language model. And it's really just at O'Reilly, my company, we recently adopted a BERT-based, natural language search engine that is giving us the Google-like power to search our content. And I wonder sometimes if that's almost like IBM releasing the design of the personal computer in 1981 and not realizing that that was going to undermine their dominance over the industry. Because I think some of these large, the ability to search and track the entire web is now encapsulated in these large language models like BERT and GPT-3.
Yeah.
And that's disruptive for the people who up till now were the only ones with that power. And so we may have some surprises. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I
And as
actually like
someone
the,
that runs a search company, I can assure you that getting that BERT model is perhaps a 10th or a 1,000th% of what it takes to actually create a search engine.
Yeah, I get, well, again, I'm not saying a search engine at internet scale, but at O'Reilly, we have a body of tens of thousands of books and videos, and we actually are able to search it pretty darn well.
yeah, but Tim, let me jump in. I think you're raising an interesting point about some new surprises, because that's what you described as a perfect example where you're using a pre-trained large language model. It's been pre-trained. A small entity or individuals now has access to it through a set of APIs. So the good thing about that is now all of a sudden, individual me can actually use that pre-trained large language model to get the kind of the compute capacity. So you've democratized it in that sense. But at the same time, think about what went into creating that large pre-trained model in the first place. The enormous, so how many entities can actually do that? And so you end up with a few entities who are able to do the massive pre-training that's required for you then to get BERT or access to GPT-3. Yeah. But so it's a surprising change in the market structure here, which now requires new tools for how to think about. But it also raises another issue. I don't know if we'll get to it at some point, which is some other concerns we might want to think about, which is, as we get to more generative everything, whether it's these generative language models or other things, all the way to what we're now doing with protein folding, you saw DeepMind crack a 50-year problem. As we get more generative AI technologies, it raises a whole other set of questions about deep fakes and a whole bunch of issues around misuse, which are different kinds of problems for which we're going to need very different kinds of tools for how we think about those concerns. Maybe that's something we can come to later in the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I want to roll back a little bit. It looked like, Kate, you wanted to say something earlier on, and we kind of outran that moment, but.
Oh, I can't remember what I wanted to say. But
oh, sorry.
I don't know. My thoughts on this are that, there are ways to structure this, and there are probably multiple ways to structure it that would be great, but the main hurdle, I think, is political, especially in a country like the US. I mean, I grew up in Europe and Switzerland, and I was actually pretty shocked when I moved here at how opposed people are to any kind of regulation, and how there's just this immediate assumption that it's going to stifle innovation. And so I think that there's a lot that, smart people can think about who know about regulation, but there's also a lot that any of us can think about in terms of what political choices are we making, and what are we voting for, and who what do we value in this country, and who do we want leading it.
Yeah. I think that's really important. It kind of goes to another of the questions we were going to talk about. Are people afraid of the right things, or are they hopeful about the right things? Anybody
no,
on that?
They're not, I mean, people is, a broad term, but I feel like most of our conversations around artificial intelligence either completely overestimate what the technology is capable of and go in the more science fiction-y direction of fearing human replacement. And then there's all of these other issues, some of which, Cindy touched on, or the, the antitrust issues we were just talking about, that I feel like aren't really part of the mainstream conversation that we should definitely be focusing on. And then there's, other issues like privacy. And I mean, there's just so many things that are happening right now all around us as these technologies come into shared spaces and come into the workplace and come into the home. So I think that for the most part, we're still focused on the wrong things.
Yeah. Hey, oh, go on.
I would say this. I think we should be excited about all the amazing problems we'll be able to solve with these techniques and these capabilities. Again, I mentioned protein folding before. That's actually pretty fundamental to understanding the structure of how to think about the kind of diseases we can solve, how proteins work, how we think about even solving some of the major issues. Look at what's happened in the pandemic. I mean, I think a lot of the breakthrough that we've had in vaccine technology have also benefited from these massive computational capabilities, including machine learning. The kind of things that we can now sequence with the use of these computational techniques is just extraordinary. So I think we should be excited about a lot of those kinds of things. The things that I tend to worry about, back to the labor markets, or at least the work kinds of questions, as I said before, are less about will there be no jobs in the future, but in the very near term, how are these technologies and other technologies already starting to change how work gets done? And quite frankly, with real wage effects and even in some cases de-skilling effects for some occupations. To take this as a thought experiment, Tim, if you think about what a call center operator does, historically, it actually needed a lot of deep knowledge to be able to solve your problems, right? If you called and wanted help with whatever it was. But as we've embedded kind of scripts, which is a form of augmentation and complementing of that capability, a lot of the value is now built into the script. So it now takes arguably a less capable person to do that job. So what does that do to the content of that work? So some of these complementing things, even though we think complementing is great, it has also this other effect of potentially de-skilling some occupations, even as it adds value to others. So I think as we think about this complementing, I think as technologists in Silicon Valley, we've all fallen into wanting to talk about, oh, it's great, we're not replacing jobs, we're complementing jobs. Well, there's two ways you can complement things. There's some good ways to do that, and there's some not so good ways to do that. So I think we should be thoughtful about that, this complements conversation more than we are.
Yeah.
And I would add that goes all the way down to tech development, because you can develop tech that is meant to replace human tasks, or you can develop technology that with the idea of enhancing what people are doing. And I feel like we've in a lot of cases, again, fallen into this determinism of, oh, we must develop something that replaces the warehouse workers, rather than thinking about how we can help people do a better job.
I think that's totally right. Can we hold this discussion? We are going to run some instant polls with the audience, and I think we're going to run the first of them right now. The impact of AI. We're asking, what do you think the impact of AI will be on privacy? What do you think the impact of AI will be on jobs, the future of work? If you can answer these questions, those of you in the audience, will have a report back in a moment about what the results were. I think let's just keep talking and we'll come back with the results in a moment. Let me just pick up this last conversation. One of the things that strikes me as potentially interesting is the way you're talking about that call center example. We've atomized the job. There's so much human work that used to be done in small groups. If you look at human evolution, it was the evolution of cooperative groups being a competitive advantage. And in some sense, a lot of these technologies are isolating, where we basically, we're reducing jobs, particularly these low-level jobs, to a single person. And I want to come back. Actually, we're just getting the poll results, sorry, but I want to come back to that question. What do we think the impact of AI will be on privacy? 5% of you think it's positive. About 30% of you think that it's roughly equal. 64% think it's negative. So that's kind of, Cindy, you got your work cut out for you.
Yeah.
You know that already. What do we think the impact of AI will be on jobs, future work? 27% positive, 51% pluses and minuses, 21% negative. little bit more equivocal there. So anybody, if anybody wants to respond to that in the course of the conversation now, feel free. Any of you?
There's two more questions. I don't, do you want to just do the first two and then the other two?
Oh, I'm not seeing them up there.
If you scroll down.
Okay, sorry. There we go. Okay, what do you think the impact of AI will be on personal well-being? Again, that actually pretty much, that's the first one, more positive. What do you think the impact of AI will be on personal safety? Also more positive. AI on quality of relationships. Again, pluses and minuses, probably weighting a little bit to the negative. So what do you think?
Well, my only comment, Tim, is at least on the work question, which came out, I think the majority view was a plurality, which said both positive and negative. That is certainly consistent with the majority of the research, by the way. If you look at all the bodies of research that have come out, it points to both negative and challenging effects. So at least that is the audience is very consistent with the research, most research out there.
Yeah.
And I think it's, I mean, I'm not at all surprised about the privacy. This is a big priority for EFF. I think that one of the things that underlies a lot of people's concerns about privacy is that we don't have a baseline privacy protection law. I don't think we need, I mean, there might be AI specific things we want to do, but I think what we really need is a baseline privacy protection law in the United States that's enforceable. And we have an attempt at one in the EU, but I think we're still learning where the holes are in that. And it may have to be iterative. We've got a nascent one in California, but we're still putting it into place. But, you know, baseline privacy protection for us and our data and giving us enough control over our data and the right to a remedy if something is if our data is misused would lay a foundation for a lot of the uses of our data that would be beneficial, whether it's medical or other or otherwise, you know, just, you know, AI helping us figure out the best traffic patterns through a city. All of those kinds of things can be done, but without a baseline privacy protection, I think people are feeling out of control and they're feeling out of power. And if we put that in place, it's not just AI that would get better for this. I think a lot of things would get better for this. And that's really what it points toward. And so when I see privacy come up in this kind of context, I feel like, you know, it's not really about AI. It's about how, you know, whether it's targeted advertising or the NSA tapping into the, you know, the backbone of the internet or any of the other ways in which, you know, our privacy is not being valued as society. We need to shore that up in general, and that'll give us the strong foundation to go and think about the other problems.
If I could add something to that, Cindy, in the following sense, I think one of the conversations that maybe hasn't come up so far is regards to privacy. I think when we think about privacy, we're mostly thinking, or at least talking about consumer or individual privacy out in the world. You know, I think, Tim, you know this, I've been co-chairing California's Future of Work Commission for the state of California. And one of the key things we heard a lot through talking to different worker groups and worker unions, for example, was concern about data in the workplace, which is a little bit different than data for people as consumers or out in the world. Yep. And so one of the key questions that has come up is, should there be some regulations about data in the workplace and, you know, kind of workplace privacy, if you like, because a lot of this data can be quite helpful, if you like, for employers to make workplaces more efficient, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But how do we think about the privacy rights in the workplace as opposed to kind of out in the world, which is a new, interesting question.
Yeah, there's a set of lessons from history about, you know, almost every technological innovation changes the structure of power in society. And we really are still talking about power asymmetries and how we address them. And in that regard, kind of following up on, you know, what Cindy was just saying and try to tie it together with Kate's sort of history of animals, you know, in some sense, the question is, were animals really, did they advantage the power of one group over another, or was that power evenly distributed? And how is that, you know, does that analogy help us? You know, and I think about this from the point of view of, should we have a personal AI that helps us with our privacy, rather than, for example, well, we have this EULA that gets stuck in our face and we can't even read it. It's 40 pages long and we just say yes, whatever, whereas, hey, we already know that, a machine can read, a million pages of contracts and go, oh, that's bullshit, and fight back. So is there a way to give us more power through giving us a personal agent, as opposed to having the power of AI simply working for big companies?
So Tim, I think the question becomes, how do you figure out that this piece of software is actually serving you? I think one of the contradictions that we live in is we use a lot of free services. I do, you do. And the implicit exchange that has happened is that there's no privacy, that your data can be used in any which way. This also goes back to what Cindy was saying about things like interoperability. Let's face it, there's no reasonable way to go from one social network to another and have any of that history come along with you, or for you to be able to talk to your friends. If mail had been invented by these companies in like 2010, none of us would have been able to email each other. Like, that's the world that we live in. So to me, the things like your own personal AI agent needs to come in the context of business models that focus on you. If it's going to be a free AI, you know what it's going to do? It's going to tell you, well, don't really look for a plumber. I have a great plumber that you can use. That's kind of that. You get what you pay for. And if you don't pay for anything, you get someone that has to balance their needs with yours.
No,
I would say that there are plenty of services that I pay for that do that too, right? I buy movies and then I still get the, I'm a member of Netflix and I still get the promotional stuff that they want to see. I don't want to just call them out, but I would say that just because you're paying doesn't mean you're not, also being thing. I do want to, on that point, EFF just released a white paper last Friday called Privacy Without Monopoly, Data Protection and Interoperability, to try to get at one of these issues, right? How do you interoperate, say, with the social network, take your stuff while having a privacy protective experience? And so we took that problem on because it's one of the reasons why at least Facebook has been very resistant to interoperability. They point at something like Cambridge Analytica and say, the answer to the misuse of data by Cambridge Analytica is it all just ought to stay with Facebook. And so we're taking that problem on and beginning to think about how to address an interoperable world that also protects your privacy. I'd be very curious, because I know this audience is people who think deeply about this. It's our first best effort to try to take on these problems, but I don't think we have cornered the market on it. But I think we have to take on these problems if we're going to have a privacy protective world that isn't controlled by just a few big companies.
Yeah, and it's funny, your point about Cambridge Analytica, of course, is Facebook was totally in control. If they had simply released, you can download your friends, but you can't get your friends of friends, then there wouldn't have been a problem. It was how expansively they treated that question.
Yeah, I mean, it was not an argument made in the best of faith, but it is one that has caught a lot of people's attention, and so we want to kill it dead.
Yeah. So I'm seeing so many great questions from the audience, and I want to. I guess I'm going to start rolling backwards. An anonymous questioner said, "How will AI impact censorship, especially countries like China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey?" Any thoughts on AI and censorship?
Well, I think we're already seeing it. I mean, I think that the old school way that you did censorship was you had a little list of blocked words and you block those words. And, now when you apply machine learning systems, again, I'm not sure how many said this is AI, but machine learning systems, you can begin to not just do the kind of blanket particular banned words things, but a more sophisticated way to try to figure out what's going on in a conversation and block it, from the perspective of the censor, block it better. Because we know that people will just pick other words, right? People know how to get around word filters. So it's part of this cat and mouse game around censorship and authoritarian governments that we need to keep an eye on, and we need to make sure that we're not helping.
Interesting question from Joseph Gliders. He says, the only question I think is worthwhile answering is how AI will be able to positively impact sustainability of our presence on the planet. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's a big question, and I think it's, obviously it's about the future of our planet. So I think it's hard to argue that it's not an important question given where we are. It's very tremendously important. I think AI as a technique can do lots of good things. I think we need the political will, though. I mean, I think that, we have lots of models telling us about dangers around climate change right now that are, it's not a technical problem to figure out that we have a problem. It's a political and legal problem to actually begin to solve it.
Well, there is some really interesting work. I think of the Institute for Computational Sustainability, which is doing something that I love this quote from Paul Cohen, who used to be the DARPA program manager for AI, where he said, the opportunity of AI is to help humans model and manage complex interacting systems. And of course, that is, when we think about sustainability, that's the essence of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with systems that have been too complex for us to understand the implications of what we're doing. And we're starting to have the tools to do better at that.
Yeah.
And so I think there is a way forward there.
I think in terms of incentive structures, I don't think there is anything inherent about AI that is going to be for or against sustainability. So if you think about people and free markets, I think the question becomes, is it possible to create profitable companies that use these kinds of structures? Or should governments, for example, establish a fund that gives money to startups that want to explore problems that would otherwise not be possible? It goes back to the point of when it comes to sort of societal good, expecting just private companies to solve these problems, I think is just in general is hard.
Yeah, you've just picked up on a question earlier from Elaine Chapin. She said, what's the role of government-funded research in shaping AI's future?
Well, I think government-funded research is going to be really, really important, Tim. There's been a lot of work that's been done, and I was involved in some of it, looking at just how do we fund? Are we spending enough time, enough investment publicly and through governments and other mechanisms investing in AI and a few of these foundational technologies? And quite frankly, the short answer is we're not. If you think about the history of R&D investment, and even science-based investment in the US economy, its peak was in 1964, actually.
Wow.
And since then, and then it was roughly about 2% of GDP. If you look at all the system level R&D in the system, it's been coming down ever since as a percentage of our GDP. So the question is, how do we do that? And yet we have other countries, China being an example, the prominent example, obviously, where obviously starting from a much lower base, they're investing at a much faster clip into these foundational technologies, whether you think about AI or synthetic biology or any of these kind of foundational technologies. So we have to spend and invest a heck of a lot more than we're doing so far. Much of the R&D today in AI and these related technologies is mostly being done by a few private sector companies, and so we have to do a heck of a lot more. I think it also goes to another topic which seems to have come up in the chat, which is these issues of use and misuse and even national security. I think one of the really challenging things about AI, unlike other things you might think of in a weaponized sense, whether it's nuclear weapons or chemical weapons, is that at least with those other systems, they're very costly to put together and even to use. And B, when somebody uses them, you can find out, right? It's impossible to set off a nuclear weapon on the planet anywhere without anybody knowing. But when it comes to these AI technologies, which can be incredibly weaponized, you don't know. So when the power grid goes out, was it just a power grid failure? We don't know, right? So the detectability of the misuse of AI creates these much, much more complex questions about misuse, whether it's from criminals, from terrorists, or from authoritarian governments, et cetera, et cetera. So these are new kinds of questions we're going to have to grapple with these new capabilities.
And the only addition that I have on what James said right now is it's actually worse than just money going to universities. Part of what I saw in the last 20 years sitting at Google was that we had the best and the biggest data sets. Same for Facebook. So if you were a doctoral student, it made so much more sense to come work in my ads team because you got to train your models on 5 billion queries every day, as opposed to a data set of 40,000 words at some university data set, and maybe not a whole lot of compute. There are like structural issues that we have to solve in just encouraging this kind of basic research. Yes, it's money, but by now, it's far more interesting as a computer scientist to work at a large tech company than it is to sit away in some corner lab.
Is there a problem also in the style of government innovation? I'm thinking, for example, that peak in 1964 was the Apollo moon program, and NASA was a big part of that. And there were 400,000 people working at NASA. It was actually a government program, where so much of the investment today is actually given to private companies, who are then allowed to privatize all the gains. You look, for example, at the advances in the pharma industry, generally funded by the U.S. The actual innovation is government funded. The pharma companies basically job is to navigate through the approval process, do trials and so on, rather than necessarily doing as much of the fundamental innovation. Have we structured the way our government invests in technology wrong?
Well,
I think does it create enough of a commons, I guess, is the question.
I mean, I think that, I'm not going to take a position on the bigger question, but, part of what we've done is that we have created, we haven't required open access, right? We haven't required, we've given the companies not just the money to do it, but the ability to control it afterwards. And the government can just simply stop doing that. It really is, again, I'm sorry, because maybe I'm just the lawyer on the panel, but like, these are legal and social and societal questions, not particularly technical ones. I mean, sure, I think it'd be great if we had really robust government labs. Again, I think that would be okay. But if we made the people who are taking the government money have to give the information and the response and give the value back to the commons, we could do a lot. We could do a lot, and EFF has worked really hard along with a lot of other people for open access to just scholarly journals, right? Just information that the government has helped fund to get back out there, and that to me is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. What do the commons look like in the age of AI? What kind of big data needs to be out there for training data sets? What kind of technology needs to be out there?
Yeah, and in fact, on that point, if I could just jump in briefly, Tim, one of the things that's been developing and gathered steam at the end of last year, I think is going to happen this year, is much like there's a National Institutes of Health, for example, is a mechanism and a structure to fund research. There's been a development which is to create this national compute infrastructure. I think a few companies are going to contribute to that. It started to gather momentum last year. Stanford's going to be part of it, MIT and a few others, but it's almost like a consortium model to build at least some compute capacity to be able to create a bit of a commons, if you like, or a public infrastructure to support research. So I think it's initiatives of that form that could actually make a big difference. I think we just need to encourage that to happen, and to happen at as big a scale as it can happen.
Yeah, and if you make it a requirement of getting a government contract, you've got to, the government has a very strong lever. They do lots of things as a condition of government contracting. Google, Amazon, they have huge government contracts. So, it's again, we know how to do this as a society. We decided not to. We could decide to do it.
Yeah. Hey, I want to pivot back to another question from a different question from the audience, and then I want to do another poll. So this is really a question very directly to Kate from someone who's anonymous. How will AI impact personal lives and personal spaces? By the way, let me just say, and when Kate's finished, why don't we run the next poll? How will AI impact personal lives and personal spaces? Is there anything we can learn there from the examples of animals?
Oh, so much. I mean, we were talking about privacy earlier, and of course, one of the big differences between AI and robots and animals is that animals can't tell anyone your secrets. But when it comes to our social, emotional relationships with animals and with these technologies, we have so much to learn, because I work in social robotics and human robot interaction, and the main concern that we hear from people about, our work in healthcare or education is that the robots are going to replace human relationships. And that was actually one of the poll questions that we had earlier, where people seemed not too, but a little bit worried about AI's impact on personal relationships. And I don't know if this is what they meant, or whether they were reading it as, oh, the algorithms, have turned my uncle into a political crackpot, and that has destroyed our relationship. But one of the main concerns I get a lot is that these technologies could replace human relationships in some way. So when we have, educational robots working with kids, it's often, oh, is this going to replace a teacher? But if you look at the history of how we've used animals in therapy, in education as our companions, there are actually, people had the same concerns about animals when animals started becoming part of family life in America. And people started, making dogs part of their families. The dogs would live in the house with them. And some people in the psychology community were concerned that this could, take away from human relationships, or, be an unhealthy emotional connection. And of course, that's turned out to be absolutely not true at all. We have completely added animals as a supplement to our social lives, because we're incredibly social creatures. We develop relationships with anything, really, and it doesn't necessarily detract from our human to human relationships. So I think that when it comes to that concern about our personal lives, I'm not worried about a sex robot replacing your partner. I'm more worried about the sex robot having compelling in-app purchases, and that being a consumer protection issue. So I think, again, we're focused on kind of the wrong concerns, whereas privacy, consumer protection, these monopoly questions are the real issues. And again, they're issues not necessarily with the technology itself, but with kind of the political, social choices around it.
Thanks, Kate. Can we have that next poll? Okay, who do you trust to inform you about the potential positive and negative impact of AI? All right. Okay. Academia looks like the big winner.
Yep.
Museum second.
Yeah, NGOs and museums second. Yeah. Boy, not much trust in business or government, and media not too far behind. Well, is there anybody who wants to disagree with that assessment, or are we all just going to give it a big thumbs up?
I think trust in general is a really big issue today. And I think, the last 4 years with all the talk of fake media and so on has eroded our trust. I think it's a really big problem. And I think, yes, there should be technology solutions to this. Academia and NGOs can help. But I actually think that there's just a larger problem here that businesses can also address. And this is one of the things that we are sort of, we are thinking about as we build Niva, our new search engine, because we think that it's really hard for people to tell what is actually trustworthy. And to make that clear and more understandable is actually a place I think AI can help in a pretty big way.
So, and I actually wonder, Srita, if I could maybe ask you this question, because you made the comment earlier about the role that incentives play.
Yeah.
The thing that I took away from that poll results is that the trusted ones seem to be the ones where people understand and trust the incentives behind them. If you look at the ones that were mistrusted, business and government, I wonder whether the issue there is really just a mistrust of the incentives that motivate behavior by those entities,
100%.
unlike academia and NGOs or museums.
100%. I think this incentive structure is the interaction that you're having with an entity. Does it have a firm basis in the right incentive? When we started Niva, not only did we say we were never going to show any ads, but we also made a pledge that we wouldn't take money from anybody other than our customers. We said, we're not going to show affiliate ads. We're not going to do any data relationships, because we want to be that trusted source. Obviously, that's us as a company saying it, and we have to earn that trust over time. But I think like you hit the nail right on its head, where you say people need to understand the incentive structure, and they need to feel when they're interacting with an entity that either the entity like truly wants to at least put out its version of the truth, or is solidly in your camp. You want a personal AI that doesn't monetize with advertisements, but it says it monetizes only with like you're paying it something. Of course, even companies that make money can do bad things. But to me, that basic alignment and the principles that companies agree to abide by is a really important part of this trust relationship.
I think in AI, there's a specific, there's a kind of very acute trust problem, because it's very difficult for people to understand what it's doing or how it's working. And so I think that while I'm very grateful that academics and NGOs were high up on the trust thing, I will tell you that as an NGO, trying to figure out enough about how some of these systems are working so that we can place our criticisms correctly is really, it's very difficult. And I think there's a lot of work to be done around transparency. I mean, obviously, for a lot of machine learning systems, the people who are programming it don't even know why it spits out the answer it spits out. But if at least you know what you were trying to solve for. And I think that, so I think there's a lot of room for transparency so that those of us on the more trusted list of this can actually do the work. You know, academics have just pounded on the door of Facebook to try to get enough information to be able to figure out how to criticize the algorithm. And I think that that's one of the things. And then the second thing I will note is I do think that the way that the free service advertising business model has been promoted by businesses for a very long time has really eroded people's trust, because it was these are two-faced systems, right? And for the longest time, all you got was I get free email. And then later, people have slowly started to realize, or at least people like me have been sounding the alarm, where people realize actually there's something else going on here. And it's the way the business model for targeted advertising works, and the erosion from non-targeted advertising to non-targeted advertising was not explained to people. So I think that, you know, in some ways, a lot of the businesses who are using these systems are not trusted for a good reason.
Yeah, I think you're raising a really good point there. I guess the question is, at what point, you know, clearly people are paying for a lot more things online than they used to. You know, their subscription services are on the rise. There's a lot of, you know, digital commerce when you think about apps and so on. But advertising is still dominant. Do you think there's really going to be, you know, is there going to be enough to be a shift for people to value things like a search engine and pay for it?
Well, that's the premise that we had when we started Neva. That's the premise that our investors have. So, you know, at least I have to say yes. But I think the important thing to remember here is that information we consume and how we consume it. Search engines are the portal to that. I tell people that it's like the ultimate expression of human curiosity. And I think for really important functions like that, there certainly is a place for a paid product. A fair question is, well, is there going to be you know, some kind of like subscription fatigue? I agree with that. On the other hand, not so long ago, we would perhaps read 2 or 3 newspapers and not 50, as we have come to expect now. Plus, we don't quite know who to trust anyway. So I think there'll be a shift in consumption patterns. But I think for the most critical functions in our life, having trustworthy services, having services that unabashedly say they work for you and they have clean business models, I think there is a here.
I totally agree with you. There's a question here from, again, an anonymous questioner. Says, if people profit from my data, why can't I get a cut? Now, I have a quick answer for that, which is, if you got a cut, it would be very, very small. You know, if you actually do the math and you divide Google or Facebook's revenue by their number of users, and even more if you divide their profit by the number of users, you know, you would basically be getting a few pennies, or at most a few dollars a year. And if you think you don't get a few dollars worth of value from those services, don't use them.
Yeah,
no, but there's no alternative, though. I think, and the other quick thing that I'll add on to that is, you gave up that right when you signed up for the service and for the free service and said you were going to keep using it. That bargain was struck kind of a long time ago, and we don't get to change it along the way unless there's a dramatic shift to the model.
Yeah.
Well, I would say that all the companies that had you sign up for this thing reserve the right for them to change it. And Google has, and Facebook has over time. So I'm very, I want to push back a little hard on the, you made your bed, now lie in it, since the companies don't do that.
No, I don't think it's you made your bed. I think the real question is, an individual getting paid is very unlikely. An individual taking the power of saying, we want better terms in how you use our data and you only use it for us instead of against us, I think is a much more productive discussion than one.
I completely agree. And I agree for another reason. One is that I think that privacy is a right. It's not something that you should be, that should be subject to selling it. That's very regressive, right? That means poor people have no privacy and rich people do. Yeah. And we don't want that. That is not the world that we want to build. And so we have to be really careful about some of the way that the monetization conversation happens, because it's extremely regressive. I also think that while I'm perfectly supportive of subscription business models, like there's not just two ideas for how to make money on the internet, either you pay for it or you're tracked to death. And that's used against you. There's lots of things in between, that we have a search engine now called DuckDuckGo that does not targeted advertising, but contextual advertising. So even in the context of advertising, there are different ways to do it that are more or less problematic. And then there's subscription models, and then there are other things. So, and I think to me, the fun stuff might be what the other things start to look like over time.
Yeah, let me come to a couple more key questions that we wanted to ask here today. One is, what are the key levers to make sure increased productivity benefits everyone rather than further concentrating wealth?
Well, this one is hard, Tim, because one of the, just to agree with perhaps where the question was going, right? If you look at the last, productivity used to be great in the sense that, when productivity went up, wages went up, and it was fairly kind of relatively well distributed. But increasingly these days, we do get productivity growth without necessarily getting the wage gains in the way that they used to work before, this kind of decoupling between productivity and wage gains. And when wages go up, they've tended to go up at the top. So the question is, what about the rest of everybody? And I think that's where, we have to grapple with the fact that if these systems and technologies and the way our economy works creates these enormous surpluses, what do we do about that? So that's where you have ideas, everything from universal basic income to let's just raise the minimum wage to other subsidy models. But I think we have to get at that, because in a world in which, most people the vast majority of people derive their livelihood from work, which is the majority of people. The number of people who get incomes from investment is tiny. It really is. People get income from their labor for the most part. What do we do
people
when
get income from their investment get a lot more? And that's
but there aren't that many, right?
I'm afraid.
Tim, there aren't that many.
I know, but the point is, the point is, we have designed to optimize for a tiny number of people getting more.
Exactly.
More as
Right.
Yeah.
So the question is, when people rely for the most part on their labor as a way to generate their livelihood and income, what happens when that labor doesn't get the gains in productivity reflected in wage gains? What do we do about that? So I think that's where you have to play with, is it UBI? Is it subsidies? Is it raised minimum wages beyond its marginal product? Do you raise taxes? What do you do, right? You have to play in that space. Simply saying, people should work harder isn't going to work, quite frankly, as a solution.
We need radically different
we need radically
solutions.
Yeah. I mean, if I could add one other quick point on this. This is a topic I'm pretty passionate about, as you can tell. So if you looked at the 100-year history, right, of the US economy or any advanced economy, one of the things you see is that the labor share of national income has been slowly declining. It's understandable why that is the case, because, hey, if you built a factory in 1900, chances are all your inputs were labor inputs. probably at the 99% level. So of course, labor's share of that income was very, very high. But nowadays, factories and other systems, it's a combination of capital inputs and labor inputs. So the labor share has been declining. And in fact, that declining has accelerated a little bit in the last 20 years. So the question is, even before you get to how it's distributed, that labor income is a smaller share of the national economy. So what do we do about that, even when the economy is growing? So you have to get to these kind of distributive conversations one way or the other.
Yeah. So the other key question we wanted to have all of you address is what actions can the audience take as technologists, as consumers, as students, and as citizens to realize our best hopes and mitigate our worst fears?
Tax the rich and smash capitalism. That's what you were saying, James, right?
No. I didn't say that, Kate. Just be perfectly clear. We wrote a paper about this in December. The capitalist model is remarkably terrific, and it's been an amazing economic growth, prosperity generator. The question is, how do we want to tweak it or adjust it, right? Keep in mind that capitalism has not been the same thing for the last 300 years, by the way. The version that we have mostly came into place in the 70s, actually. It's always evolved and adapted itself. The question is, for the next while, what adaptations and tweaks do we want to make to it? I'm certainly not for throwing it out, not even close. But I think we have to change the rules. As Tim has said, I think at the beginning, we make choices about how it works as a society. So I think it's time to examine those choices.
I was just joking. Capitalism is not an either or. There are so many different ways to structure it.
Exactly.
I think we all need to remember that capitalism should serve democracies, not the other way around. And it can be tweaked, as all of you are saying. And the current regulatory, antitrust, and innovation structure is not really designed to share the wealth that we are creating. It's sort of going to a remarkably small set of people.
So I think that, I don't think, so what do you have to do? You have to get involved. You have to vote. You have to build things ethically. You have to talk to other people about it. You have to make your voice heard, whether that's, joining EFF. Sorry, I have to, that's part of my job description. And letting us have a bigger pile of voices to stand on, or whatever other organization is working to do this. These things take action, not just by individuals alone. They take us all pulling together. Because we need to put the right people in place, whether that's in government or, with the choices that we have for business or the rules that we need to have in order to help get us to this place that I think we actually have a pretty remarkably shared view of where we want to get to and the obstacles. So that part's done, which is kind of great. Now we need to just do it. And I think that is easier said than done, but important.
Yeah, we have a third audience poll. Well, let's run that now. All right, which of the following actions will increase your trust in AI?
It was a multi-choice.
All right, well.
Yeah, it was a multi-choice.
CEO's pledge is the lowest.
Yeah. Oh, yes. All right, well, kind of interesting. Second, first is develop code of ethics. Second, regulation. A third, an expert commission to monitor. I think we need to put on our thinking caps and come up with some better options.
I mean, there are tons of AI code of ethics. EFF has been involved in a couple, and we finally just stopped after a while because there were just way too many. I think that what we really need is a enforceability mechanism, because codes of ethics are only as good as the actual implementation. And so far, there's a lot of creation of codes of ethics and almost no ability to really actually hold people to it by any of the people who are creating them. So codes of ethics are great, but really you've got dozens to choose from right now. The thing that we need to think about is how do we implement and how do we enforce and how do we create accountability around a lot of the good ideas.
All right.
Spot on, Cindy.
Yeah, because we're running out of time. the Computer History Museum has a one-word initiative, and you were asked to write down one word of advice for a young person starting out in their career. Can you share your one word and the story behind why you chose it? Who wants to go first?
Going to do it in a sequence?
Whatever.
Sure, I'll go.
Passion.
Passion. I picked this word because I think it's important to work on something that you're truly passionate about. I'm a software engineer by training, and I can tell you that time stops still when I'm working on a coding problem that I really like. And to have something like that be work makes it not work. So passion's my word.
Okay.
I can go. My word that I picked was justice. EFF works to make sure that technology supports freedom, justice, and innovation for all the people of the world. That's our organization. I think that for us around AI right now, there's not enough attention being made to what it will take to make sure that AI is serving justice in the world.
And who's next? Kate, James?
Sure, I can go. I chose integrity. The stories around it are best told over drinks, but I will say that while I think it is important to, care what other people think, and it's important to be strategic, I think that it's also easy to fall into caring too much what other people will think of you, or being opportunistic. And what then happens is that leaves us with a world full of assholes and cowards, both of whom cause a lot of damage. So I chose integrity, being true to yourself, not being afraid to burn some bridges when you have to stick up for what you believe in.
Okay, my word is, I don't know if you can see this, reimagine. And I chose reimagine because I think we have an opportunity to reimagine how all of this works. I think that, how capitalism works, how our economy works, how our systems, how our rules, our regulations work. We have an incredible opportunity. I think if we can succeed in reimagining how all of this works, I think the bounty is enormous. Think about all the problems we could solve. Think about the diseases we could solve. Think about the economic surpluses we could create and all share in and participate in. I just want us to reimagine how it all works.
Yeah. I wasn't asked to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. I'm going to put out a word that I just wrote down, which is kindness. Because ultimately, all of this technology is to make our lives better as people. And to make the world flourish in a way that we can all pass on to our children, our grandchildren, and on into the foreseeable future. So, and that really starts with a kind of empathy, and machines, seem to many of us to be the opposite of empathy. And I believe are also incredible tools for amalgamating and aggregating our collective wisdom as a species. And we're going to have to go forward with a lot more kindness to get it right. So with that, we're going to have to wrap up, but we're going to turn this back over to Daniel Lewin. Thank you so much, all of you, for being part of this discussion. Obviously, I'm very apologetic to all of the people who posted questions we didn't get to. There were some amazing ones, and I wish we could be continuing to go on with all of them. But thank you very much for being here. And over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Tim, and the panelists. I can't thank you enough. Let me just do a quick summary. Fundamental question was, should we fear AI? And I think when you listen to this program and the different perspectives, and then thinking through the summary one words of the individuals, there are social, political, industry, business issues, but at the heart of it all is the individual impact. I think Tim's word about kindness and the fundamental premise of this should be in the service of the human spirit is key. And I think James was particularly prescient in framing the issues about the recalibration and the structural change that AI is bringing about in society. It really is a matter of thinking through the changes in structure that are being driven by these machines that are being data driven and then programmed by people. So they should be in service to us. So I think this program illustrates a very important set of issues. And with world-class experts like those on our panel, I don't think we could have asked for a better time spent over the course of the last 90 minutes. So thank you all for your participation. And those who are not members of the museum, will encourage you to support CHM. You can go to our website. There's an opportunity to be a member. We'll encourage your support at these critical junctures. So again, thank you all for your time, and thank the panelists and Tim for excellent orchestration. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.